So, welcome to Coastal Drone Weekly Live, where we discuss live to our members various drone topics for both new and experienced drone professional pilots. Today is March 13th, 2024, and this week we're discussing the impending deadline for remote ID enforcement. In this episode, we're going to cover what is digital conspicuity, what is remote ID, what happens when the deadline crosses, how to be compliant, and why it matters to people outside of Canada. My name's Ian. I've got Jen and Finn with me today, and let's kick it off. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about digital conspicuity, what is remote ID, the implications of it, what's the plan for Canada, and then we'll open up some questions and discussion. So, take it away, Finn.
So, what is digital conspicuity? We had to practice saying that. Also known as electronic conspicuity, if you ask some people. In general, this is just the ability or requirement for someone to have any type of digital trace. Now, there's in real life, we kind of have this with things like cookie tracking and facial recognition and things like that. But this is something that is being introduced into aviation. ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, says that digital conspicuity is the key to increase safety by reducing the likelihood of mid-air collisions, especially in Class G uncontrolled airspace. It will help other airspace users to be more aware of any aircraft operating in the same airspace. So when we're thinking about what this is the ability for aircraft to be tracked digitally, primarily by air traffic controllers. So in aviation, we have a number of different types of traditional digital conspicuity. And it takes the form of secondary surveillance. So primary surveillance is the actual radar dish. This is more an analog thing. This is the Luftwaffe is flying over the English Channel and the RAF is pointing the radar at them and seeing blips on the radar screen. That's what primary surveillance is. Secondary surveillance is the ability for that radar return to provide more information. So in our aircraft, we have what's called a transponder, and this transponder has ADSB. ADSB stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. And what our transponders in our aircraft are able to do is not only broadcast the location of the aircraft, they're able to broadcast other information like the call sign of the aircraft, and another important thing is the altitude of that aircraft.
And sorry, just to step backwards, we were talking about transponders.
Mhm.
Old school and current transponders, like you see the one in the picture here right now, they'll receive a radio pulse and then they
Mhm.
reply with the code that is on the box.
Exactly. And you can actually see that this transponder is a Mode C transponder because it's got an alt setting. So when we say a Mode C transponder, this is a transponder that is able to broadcast an aircraft's altitude.
Yeah, so it sends back code plus
Mhm.
altitude in really simple.
Exactly. So when traditional aircraft goes flying, they talk to ATC and ATC says squawk 1234, and then I would put 1234 into my transponder, and that's my code for that day.
Yeah, and ATC is air traffic control.
Air traffic control. That's right. The other
Could be a
one,
lot of
I
acronyms
know.
probably today, so we got to be careful.
The other one that we have is called TCAS, which is Traffic Collision Avoidance System. This is something that is built into mostly larger airliners. And what it will actually do is if the TCAS system, it speaks to all of the other TCAS systems. And what it will do is if it detects a collision, it will tell the pilot what to do. And the great thing about TCAS is it will tell both pilots different things. So
Yeah.
it will tell one pilot, turn to the right. It'll turn another pilot, turn to the left.
Yeah.
So we have an example of a TCAS here if you want to.
So it's telling the pilot to descend.
So then in the other aircraft, it would tell the other pilot to climb, thus avoiding the collision.
Climb now, climb now.
Is that arrow telling you like where they are distance
Yes.
wise? Okay. And
Yeah,
then
in relation to where the aircraft is. So this is an example of electronic conspicuity in traditional aviation. Drones in Canada currently are prohibited from using a transponder or an ADSB signal. However, these things are required in the United States. But in Canada, we're not quite there yet. One of the newest forms of digital conspicuity is called remote ID.
one of the things you said, like drones are prohibited from having transponders in Canada. Talked about this before, like the numbers in Canada, period. There's roughly 100,000 registered drones in Canada at this point, and that's going to be a drone that's 250 grams or more. That's not counting all the micros, right? That could be 20, 30, 40,000. I honestly have no idea, but it's probably a lot. In comparison, helicopters, I think there's roughly 2,000 to 3,000 registered commercially operated helicopters in Canada. What I'm getting at here is, let's say there's 100,000 drones, there's less than 50,000 airplanes and helicopters combined. And drones all operate in low level, right? 400
Mhm.
feet typically or less. If all of these aircraft, which drones are aircraft, if all of these aircraft had transponders and they're flying around in Class G and Class C, D, and E controlled airspace, an air traffic controller, the tower, the radar scope would just be going bonkers. It would be like fireworks on the display, and they would not be able to differentiate between a drone and an airplane doing circuits in the at the airport doing training. So it'd just be chaos, and it would create such a risk to human aviation. So that's first off why drones don't have transponders in both U.S., Canada, anywhere in the world right now. It's just way too many. But they have a problem that they need to be able to see and differentiate these drones and have an idea where they are because there are security concerns, there are safety concerns, right? There's privacy concerns. And we're going to get into that. But what has happened is now we've got this digital conspicuity requirement. First off, for traffic management, they call it unmanned traffic management or RTM or sorry, UTM and now RTM for remote traffic management. The idea is as we go into beyond line of sight operations and move away from just standing there staring at the drone to sending it from Edmonton to Fort McMurray, for example, going hundreds of miles, you need to know that you know where your drone is, everyone else knows where your drone is, and the vice versa of knowing where an airplane or a helicopter is. So it's easier to implement a system now at the drone level because drones are a newer nascent industry and the technology is evolving so fast that the regulations are also able to move pretty fast relative to what's happening in aviation law. So now they're looking at, well, we need to get remote ID in place. So what is remote ID? Well, remote ID is the ability for the drone in flight to provide ID or identification and location information that can be received by other parties through broadcast. So that's the general description of it.
That's the FAA definition.
Definition. Okay, yeah. And this is under Part 89. So the scope of what we're talking about today, just so we're clear, is FAA, so Federal Aviation Administration, which is an American rule set. This does not apply to Canadians at this point or any point in the near future, but it's important for us to talk about as Canadians as well. So we will, and we'll explain about that. But just to lens this a little bit,
And as of the moment we are recording this, remote ID is not required in the states.
hold on, it is required. It's not enforced.
The date is March 16th.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
So it's been required since September 16th,
Right.
but the FAA has essentially been looking the other way because compliance has been a problem. So remote ID, what is it? It's software, first off,
Mm.
right? It's the drone is going to be constantly broadcasting its position, so GPS and altitude or elevation or height. It's going to report its serial number or some sort of unique number or address to it. And then it's also potentially going to report its home point, so where it took off from, and potentially the location of the operator of the drone. So who has to have it, right? So persons operating a drone or an unmanned aircraft registered or required to be registered under Part 47 or Part 48 of the FAA chapter. So all registered drones.
So the FAA requirements for drone registration are a little bit more complicated than they are in Canada. So for our perspective from Canadians, if your drone in the states needs to be registered, then it needs to comply with remote ID.
Yeah, and to break it down more simply, registration is required, same as Canada, 250 grams or more, or 0.55 pounds. And then the upper limit is the same. So if you have a 25 kilogram or more, or a 55 pound or more drone, you then it's not an SFOC in the states. It was a 133 exemption. Probably have the number right or wrong, rather. So there's a variance that can be granted for the registration. So if you're a Canadian and you take a Mavic 3 down to the States and you want to fly it recreationally, you need to have something called a trust exam. For the intents of our conversation, it's the equivalent of a basic. It's an online only test. It's fairly straightforward. It's one of those tests where you study as you do the test. So you learn a section, do a quiz, learn a section, do a quiz. By the time you're done all that, you have the trust certificate and it's free. There's about 8 or 10 different sites that have trust exams online. That quiz then allows you to fly a drone in the States recreationally that's any size. It doesn't matter if it's a micro or a large, you have to have the trust to fly recreationally. If the drone weighs 250 grams or more, it has to be registered. And then the limitations are you can't fly at night, you can't fly over people, and you can't fly with any potential commercial intent. So if you are recording something for YouTube, for example, even if it's recreational, but like I might sell this as stock footage, boom, that's commercial intent, part 107. So we have an FAA Part 107 course. It's lensed from a Canadian perspective. So if you already hold your advance, that's actually kind of a nice fast track for it.
Any foreign operator in the United States their aircraft needs to comply with remote ID, even if it's a micro drone. Persons operating foreign civil unmanned aircraft in the United States.
Okay. Yeah, it's a pretty blanket statement
Yep.
then. So then the micro would need it.
The way I read this regulation, a micro would need it
Okay.
if you're not American.
Okay. So when do you need it? Take off the shutdown. The standard ID must broadcast. It's undisableable.
Mhm.
It will not take off if it's disabled.
And if one of the regulations stipulates that if remote ID at any point fails or is canceled, then the pilot has to land as soon as possible.
Right.
So if you're using an external module and the module has some sort of issue, then you have to land as soon as possible.
Yeah. So it's either hard built into the drone's firmware, or if you're using a non-compliant drone and you still want to use it, or a custom built, there's a backpack module. So this talks about what we talked about already. It's going to have the serial number, the broadcast module of the person. It's the identity of unmanned aircraft consisting of the serial number assigned to the remote ID broadcast module by the person responsible for the production of the remote ID broadcast module.
This is directly from the regulations. This is why it sounds like it was written by a robot.
That's brutal. An indication of the latitude, longitude of the unmanned. Okay, so location, altitude above ground, identity of the aircraft, identity of the operator, geometric altitude, speed. Okay. So direction and speed. And then latitude, longitude of the takeoff location. So yeah, home point.
How do we comply with remote ID? So the most common one is going to be they call it just the standard. This is a software for the aircraft, and the aircraft will just start to broadcast the remote ID. Most likely, this will be either over Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. So there will need to be some sort of receiver in order for it to work. Then there's ones with a broadcast module. So this is if you have a non-compliant aircraft. For this picture, it's a picture of an airplane that will be like an unmanned airplane.
Yeah.
And there'll be a broadcast module that will be in supplement. These broadcast modules will most likely be for larger aircraft because on a DJI consumer level drone, it would just be too large.
Yeah, I think the smallest I've seen so far is like 80 grams. It's basically a small LiPo pack with a PCB board and an antenna. So for like FPV drones, there's been a few options.
This is if you go to an FAA recognized identification area. These are areas where remote ID compliance is not required. You can operate a drone as long as it's within line of sight. You can operate an aircraft within one of these zones. These can be requested. A normal person can't request a zone. Anybody can enter one of these zones unless it's like on private property, but like any person can fly in these zones. These zones can be requested by community-based groups or educational institutions. So if a university, if they have a drone club, they can set up a zone. In Canada, we have MAC fields. It will be like similar to that. If like a FPV racing club or an RC club, if they want to apply for one of these zones, they can apply for one of these zones. Then those aircraft within that zone does not need to comply with remote ID as long as that aircraft is kept within visual line of sight.
So yeah, the Canadian equivalent is MAC, or Model Airplane Association of Canada. They have exemption in some controlled airspace locations that they don't necessarily need to do a nav drone for every flight. So in the States, you don't have to have hardware. You don't have to have the remote ID broadcast module. But I was watching a video today or yesterday, and one of the comments, if the drone has remote ID, it has to still continue to use remote ID, even in the RIA or the FARI.
Next, we're going to talk about the concerns. Let's start with the basics. Privacy would be number one. People are going to know now where you're located. They're going to know where you took off from. They're probably going to know, I'm guessing, your name at some point. And that could be concerning for people if you're flying near their house and they don't like it. There could be issues with being confronted. Finn raised a point yesterday when we were chatting about this, about firearms in the States, let's be honest. There's an issue with that as well. There's more street confrontations. So if you're flying around, you might have some people getting bothered by it. It's all of those things combined. Doxing, people are going to be knowing where you are. And then if you're flying at your property, they might now know where you live, which shouldn't be an issue if you're flying at home in your own yard, but they're going to be able to know that as well and have your coordinates broadcasted. Another concern is it going to be effective? Are we going to know if it's going to work? Will authorities be able to use it and see it properly? Another concern is are they going to be able to deal with an issue in the right time? Or are those people that are maybe flying inappropriately going to be gone by the time they even get there? Again, we talked about the modules. If you have an older aircraft, you might have to now get a module for it. One of the issues as to why it was taking so long to implement this and make it now part of the law was because they were having a hard time getting these modules. The FFA saw that that was an issue, so they extended how long it took to get that. But there's still going to be issues. Now people are going to be really scrambling to buy those things. So again, it's going to have an issue with supply and demand.
I haven't had a negative interaction that I haven't turned around into a positive.
Even if you are doing it legally and appropriately and safely, they might not care about that because they've
Yeah.
already made up their mind about how they feel. So,
I normally get a call maybe once every 2 to 3 months from someone who's saying someone is currently flying over my house.
mhm.
Hmm.
They can't do this. How, like, what are my options to stop them? And so then when I read this remote ID, I think, well, now that person could potentially find like the location and name of where that person is right now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And if they're flying over their house, they're within driving distance. And that is the privacy concern that I'm a little bit that raises my eyebrow, because it's one thing for this person to call me and say there's someone flying over my house, and me just say, look, they're most likely flying it legally.
I mean, I think there is positives to that though too. Just hearing that alone, like I know I watched, not to bring up TikTok, but I watched a TikTok about she was kind of like a famous TikToker and people were flying drones in and around her house near the windows.
Mm.
And I mean, like that's pretty disturbing in itself and not,
Yeah.
not something that I think happens all the time, but this might give people, the right people a little bit of maybe some safety in the sense of that they can call that in now. And
In Canada, there's no remote ID. But if there was, would that create pause for the pilot or accountability? You're more and more aware of the fact that you're constantly being watched, and it affects your decision making as a pilot. So and it's going to affect your decision making as a drone pilot. Why does this matter to Canadians? Why is remote ID a concern? Why don't you take it away, Finn?
It's not coming yet, but it's coming in the future.
Yeah.
Most likely. I don't know if they've made an official announcement, but it is highly likely that they will implement something like this. Transport Canada from time to time will follow the FAA on, or see what the FAA is doing, then adjust the laws accordingly. So it is likely that Canada will adopt some sort of remote ID system in the future. The positive for Canada though is they're going to wait and see if there's unintended consequences of this before they implement their rules. If it blows up in the States and it's a huge disaster, then we'll have that information. We're basically Transport Canada basically is using the FAA as a remote ID guinea pig, seeing
yeah,
what happens. And then when if Canada implements a remote ID law, they'll have a lot more information, a lot more data on.
I don't think it's an if, it's a when. It's a safe opinion.
Mm,
You can be your personal opinion, and I'll share the same personal opinion that Canada will implement some sort of digital
mhm.
conspicuity.
I would agree with that opinion that it is highly likely that Canada will get some sort of remote ID law at some point in the future.
March 16th, 3 days from now, the FAA is going to start enforcing. The concern and the reality is, does the FAA have the resources to enforce this? Do they have squad cars? Do they have people hiding behind, like, the meme where there's the FAA hiding behind a bush, looking with binoculars,
Mhm.
watching what that guy is doing? Is that actually going to be something that they have the resources to spend on this? No, I don't think
Most
so.
likely not. Like, so in the biz, we call this getting ramped, and the FAA is not going to ramp drone pilots flying, especially if you're not in a built up area. Like if you're just flying in your backyard or just some field somewhere. There's a lot of some field somewhere in
it,
America.
Yeah.
They're not sending out 2 to 3 guys to to hunt you down.
Yeah. And we're not advocating non-compliance
No.
at all. There's real benefits to having digital conspicuity because it means that we've got eventually probably some tools that'll come out. Like there will be an update to TCAS or traffic avoidance tools for the aircraft that will give you some warning at low level that could be muted or something at high level so that you're not at 10,000 feet freaking out about 400-foot drones.
Hmm.
We talked about this a few weeks ago, but like a bug hits the windscreen, it's hit the windscreen before you have any idea that you even know. So,
And they're
Mhm.
impossible to see when you're
yeah,
flying.
TCAS is a global system. It is an international standard. Before that, aircraft inside their aircraft would just have their own proprietary system. So there's this Soviet, it was before the Soviet Union fell, there was a Soviet jet and this German, I think it was a FedEx flight or
Yeah,
something
wasn't
like
it a
that.
cargo ship? I
Yeah,
know
I
what
know
you're
I
talking
know it
about.
was, yeah, it was DHL.
Yeah.
And the DHL, their system told the aircraft to pull up. The Russian jet told the aircraft to pull up.
Hmm.
oh, so it just made it same
It made
worse.
it the same. So that's why we have TCAS. So this system ultimately what they're trying to prevent is traffic collisions. But the main benefit of this is to keep people
Hmm.
safe and to keep aircraft safe.
Yeah, it's not to spy on
No.
pilots that are in your
And
neighborhood.
yeah, and that's what I think too. I think like when I was watching a couple of YouTube videos yesterday and reading over the comments, people are very concerned about their privacy, which I understand and as they should be. But I think people are forgetting the part that it's not going to be those little things that they're looking at, like you said, a guy in a field. It's going to be the people that are doing the things that are illegal. So, don't do illegal things, don't get in trouble.
Max, you still with us?
I had looked into this, it would have been like 2022 for some clients. There's definitely like a longer term intention from Nav Canada's view. I don't represent Nav Canada, but I do have a few emails from them stating their stating their positions. They talk a lot about how a DSB is kind of limiting in the number of frequencies that they can use, and they want to make sure that they're not kind of like bogging up that frequency spectrum with low altitude drones. Now ADSB is not, there's nothing preventing an RPAS pilot from putting an ADSB transponder on their drone in Canada. TC says it's up to you, and Nav Canada says we prefer if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the prefer is more like you must not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I would expect if you're doing regular, heavily controlled or, high altitude or overweight, I think they're going to get to the point where they kind of assign you a slot. At this point, we don't have the tech here, right? Right.
That's a really good point.
Whereas the States is, in terms of cell networks and stuff like that, which is the kind of current plan, you're kind of limited by
Mhm.
geography.
Yeah. Yeah, miniaturization of satellite links is gonna be probably the next big step in UTM or RTM. That's a really good point because and that's kind of why ADSB has come into Canada is because for even terrestrial radar coverage up north is not good. I think if you go northeast of Nunavut, it was no radar coverage across to Greenland, right? So now they have satellite based ADSB so that they can see airplanes. The in general, this whole system has a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place before, and that's a good point. Like I guess we'll see a second generation of remote ID would probably be 5G based or some sort of cellular LTE based because you're already seeing like the latest Mavics. It's more and more common to see drones have LTE connectivity built into them because the latency is low enough that you can have a cellular connection to your controller instead of a Wi-Fi based technology or OcuSync or whatever they want to rebrand it as. But instead of a point to point connection, it's a point to cellular and then back to your controller. So you've got that beyond line of sight connectivity. But in Canada, well, it's not going to work for a while. So the current focus for Canadians again is on the beyond line of sight enablement, right? So then 2025 rules are going to come in. They're focused primarily on beyond line of sight in unpopulated areas or out in limited areas. So again, same problem that Max brought up. There is no cellular coverage. So there's going to be less of a concern about that and less of a concern about air to air interaction because in theory these are areas that are low risk or less populated. The other side of remote ID, what it will enable to some extent, hopefully, if you're operating a drone beyond line of sight, one of the key components that you have to satisfy when you're building your special flight operations certificate in Canada is detect and avoid, right? So the ability to detect other aircraft and also other drones. You need to be able to essentially eliminate any risk of air to air interaction with drones. So or with aircraft. And so there's optical based systems, there's radar and Doppler systems, there's digital conspicuity systems. And so remote ID, if required at all levels for all drones that were bigger than 250 gram or all drones, would be in theory one way to check that box that you've got a mostly compliant system. But the reality is like what's compliance like, for traditional aviation when it comes to transponders and all this stuff? It's not 100%. It's I think at this point we're in the high 80s and 90s because you cannot fly into controlled airspace without a transponder, but things break, right? You
Mhm.
have equipment failures. I've personally had it a couple times. I think I noticed the other day, I think I got a Cador for
I've the one time I was in the helicopter with you, we had a transponder issue.
yeah, we had a transponder issue that day, and I think that's when I got the Cador. So, but yeah, it's you can have equipment fail, and so it happens, same as a radio
Or you're a student pilot and forget to turn it on.
or that. So there the remote ID side of it is supposed to remove the human element, and it becomes a component or a system. So like we said, there are tools out there, there's equipment out there for Americans out there that are need this feature. At this point, pretty much when it comes to hardware, anything sold in the last 2 years from DJI is compliant. The Mavic 2 Pro is still not compliant as far as I'm aware. There is a website that we'll put in the link. It's basically a search database, just like the choosing the right drone database for Canada. There's the FAA registry for remote ID compliant drones, and they have a certificate of conformity, I think it is. So that will tell you what drone is valid. For the most part, it's been a software update. Right? So a firmware update has been required. You have to do firmware updates for your drone to be valid in its maintenance schedule. So if you've been updating your firmware, you're probably fine. You just go into the settings and put in your ID number, I think it is, and a couple other things. And if not, if you're building an FPV or if you're building a drone from scratch, there's a third party module that probably has either a disconnect feature that would not enable the drone to fly without it, or it's just a completely backpack like a Velcro module. Now, the other thing that we should confirm after the fact, and we'll put it up in the video or something here, but can you share the third party modules? Right. So if you have one remote ID module, can you use it on multiple drones if only one drone is in the air at a time? And is it attached to the operator or is it attached to the airframe?
Mm.
Because these things aren't cheap. They're like $100. So $100 Canadian. Operating a drone in residential areas, like you said, the drone spies is definitely something we've all received phone calls about that. And unfortunately there's not really anything we can do about it. Right? There's the right to privacy in your own home. So you've got if the drone is going beyond what would be considered normal privacy, then that's absolutely a concern and that's a valid complaint and you should be protected from that. So if a drone's going over your fence and looking into your yard, there's some concerns there. But if they're doing a real estate shoot facing the complete opposite direction, which is most of the situations, most times that's what it is, then having the drone be physically over your property is less of a concern if it's not looking at your property. So
I would expect that get if you assume that they can collect, that the idea would be that you'd collect all the information about the flight, right? Include, home point, pilot location, all that kind of stuff. I would expect that anything that's made available to the public would be restricted to, the drone's location and maybe some sort of unique identifier that then if they call the cops, then they can report something,
yeah.
right? right now everybody's just limited to, and it's like we've all, I mean, I don't know if we've all, I know you guys have, and I know I have received calls of people going, you know, hey, there's somebody flying a drone, they can see it in my daughter's kitchen window or something like that, right? Like there, and that happens on a regular basis, and now the only thing you can do is call the cops, and that's it. And you know, and they, and 99% of police in Canada will have no method of investigation or enforcement.
Yeah, because it's got to be seen in the act, right? There is no evidence. That's a good question. So, and I don't think this exists right now. So there's in the States with the remote ID side, there's the drone scanner app, and there's another one. There's a couple different apps, and these are apps that anyone can download and buy, and they're all free, I think. And it shows a map and it shows drones in your area, and it uses either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to scan the area and identify these. Because I think basically the remote ID is just blasting out a Wi-Fi hotspot that it connects to or a beacon. That tech is broadcasting its current location and its current home point. I, it doesn't share the historical path of the drone in that broadcast because then the packet would be huge and it would be technically more difficult to do. But does the app log that while you're scanning and then show the path? That's something that would then be a question of does that app then take that log, upload it or crowdsource it back to a global map of all drone activity in the area? Does that That's interesting because that's how ADSB works right now. ADSB, if I go on to FlightAware or if I go on to ADSB Exchange, there's a global database of all known and received position track logs, and it's then recorded in perpetuity for whatever. So you can look up any aircraft identification, see where it was at what time. If some receiver, because there's terrestrial ground-based antennas everywhere for ADSB now, even in Canada, that is crowdsourcing and pumping into these networks all this information. When is this going to happen with remote ID? So now it's like, oh, you took off at 2 o'clock at this time at this location, and you flew north, and then you went like 2 miles north. So there's no way you were still in line of sight, right? Operator flew intentionally beyond line of sight, or how do you prove that you weren't beyond line of sight, right? So now, is that going to be the reality of this? And that is a concern. Um, if you go and do something that is, let's say, okay, legal scenario, you fly the downtown Vancouver Lionsgate Bridge. It's 1,000 meters span, 1 kilometer. You have to be pretty like heroic or bionic vision to be able to fly line of sight from one side of the bridge to the other side. So realistically, you need a visual observer on multiple sides. Remote ID is not going to tell anyone else around you where your visual observers are because that tool is not required in technology and there is no mechanism for it. So now it's like, oh, that guy. So you get a ping on a map. Someone's staring at the map. Ping, someone took off a drone. Okay. Now they look at that and they see the drone flies a kilometer away. There is no way that that Mavic 3 is visual on his sight. Send the cops. Right. So you've got this response scenario based on something that's a broadcast without context. Is that where we go with this? I don't know. Like, how are you going to have tools to differentiate that? Because there's a lot of people like plane spotters that watch ADSB, and then it's like, oh, that guy's too low, right? Well, are they low because they're doing something that's authorized, or are they low because they're ignorant, or right? There's a lot of circumstances in that. So it's going to be interesting. And you're right, Max. One of the concerns is going to be, is there a barrier to the information? I don't think there is right now, and I don't know that there is because these tools, I've seen some tools provide like information about the pilot and some don't. Is that going to have some sort of restriction? And maybe this is where the Canadian differentiation is because I kind of have faith that on our side, Canada maybe will be a little more restrictive on sharing this, but my remote pilot ID isn't broadcast with it. It's just either the C number of the drone, like the C dash whatever registration number is, or some sort of unique ID that is then whoever it's registered to is at least shown, but not their home address, right? So it's not like I saw you downtown Vancouver doing this or that, and then they come to your house. So, and then that information is only available to law enforcement or government agencies, right? That's appropriate.
Mhm.
So same as your license plate,
Yeah.
right? Your license plate, everyone has a license plate. You can see your license plate, you can write down that number, but it's not easy for the general public to go in Canada, at least it's not easy for someone to go and look up a license plate and figure out who owns
And
that
get the
license plate
information.
or where they live, right? I don't think that's the same in all other states, but in Canada at least, yeah, you can take a picture of my license plate. I don't care. It doesn't mean much to the average person. So at least in British Columbia. The main thing that I wanted to point out was it's something to be aware of as a Canadian. It's a good conversation to be if you have a strong opinion about it, one way or another, it's important to voice that opinion to transport. There's CARAC, the Canadian Max. What's the acronym for it? Stand for CARAC. It's the advisory.
Canadian Aviation Regulation Advisory
That's right.
Council.
Thank you. It's
Also,
the
I have a question that
yeah.
kind of just because you were talking about somebody taking a picture of your license plate. Do you have a sense? Because I had a number from a few years ago it's useless now. How many aeroscopes are in Canada? So for folks that don't know, DJI has a product called the Aeroscope, which allows you know public service agencies to see drones within about 50 kilometers or some big number like that, right? But yeah, I was wondering if you had any kind of insight in that because I don't think there's one here, but there's definitely one in Vancouver.
I'm not sure total number, but yeah, I was aware of the Vancouver pilot project, and we've talked about it. It's public knowledge. And then in Ottawa, there's third party like Indro Robotics has their system deployed there. The aeroscopes are no longer being produced, so I don't know that they're getting deployed as much, but I would expect. Um, I think Pearson has something similar, or at least we've talked about it on podcasts before. They've threatened that they have one, but yeah, they are out there. So there's DJI Aeroscope, there's Indro makes one, or builds one. There's Blue Force as another company that makes them. There's Interdiction out there as well, where they can take over drones. But the tools are already there in Canada. We should have really highlighted that more. Thanks, Max. It's not like the system and this technology isn't in place right now. It's just not a publicly mandated open source, crowdsourced tool. So, what was the number you had from a couple years ago, Max? I'd say at least a dozen for
Yeah,
sure.
I think mine was like 6 or 8, but again, it was the kind of like hush hush around a Nav Canada table or something like that. Like there's no. And again, they're not all held by airports. They're not all held by police. It's not that level of control. I mean, like you said, they're not implementing them anymore. But it wasn't a lot, right? It's a lot less than you would have expected it to be.
Yeah, I would say it's safe to assume every international airport has one at its disposal, if not in permanent deployment. I was at the Abbotsford Air Show last year, and one was definitely in deployment because we were approached about it because we were demoing micro drones inside a tent, and it set off some alarms. So that was a federal agency that had that one, not the airport authority itself. So that's a portable unit. So air shows, right? Major events definitely was being used at like major, well, the occupation events. That was definitely they were in deployment because they're still enforcing and prosecuting drones that busted the restricted airspace during that event. So there's there's definitely tools out there, and they are out there. So, but the reality of it is, you don't do dumb or illegal things, right? If you're doing something that is going to put you in hot water because of digital conspicuity, you shouldn't be doing it. Period. It's that if you're not doing something wrong, it shouldn't be a problem. But at the same time, I also like there's civil liberties, and like this is a pretty big, airy topic
Well,
that goes far beyond drones.
I hope those extra things are the exception and not the rule. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what you're hoping, those instances when they're yeah, when they're not being used appropriately.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks for the points there. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us live on another week of Coastal Drone Weekly Live. My name's Ian. I've got Jen and Finn with me. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next week.